Mau Mau Rebellion. So just to start off with what my thesis was, my thesis is that the Mau Mau Rebellion underwent a fundamental shift from the 1960s to the present in the way it was both collectively and individually remembered by Kenyans and historians alike. Collective memory of the Mau Mau Rebellion shifted from something that was viewed as reprehensible, negative, and neglected from 1963 to 2002 because of British and Kenyan political opposition to the movement, to something that was more heroized, memorialized, but also equally emotionally hurtful from 2002 to today because of more of a reshaped political landscape. So essentially what I'm saying is that from 1963 to 2002, the way people remember this event collectively as a group is more negative, whereas it kind of shifted in the 21st century to where the Mau Mau Rebellion itself was viewed more celebratory and positive. So before I get into the rebellion itself, I'd like to talk a little bit about what collective memory actually is. So according to one historian named Constance de Saint Laurent, collective memory is when a group of people create a narrative about how they remember the past. So essentially it's also how people attempt to recall and then reproduce their experiences about a time period. But it doesn't necessarily mean that people as a collective group will recall things correctly, because you have things like forgetfulness. Over time, people forget things, and so they don't remember the event as it happened, or they don't remember the event as they remember it happened. And it's also associated with manipulation. Political leaders, for instance, can manipulate the way that people remember specific events. So another author that I looked at coming in terms of collective memory is Pierre Nora, and he had said that history is the incomplete reconstruction of past events because memories disappear over time. So that is, history cannot be necessarily complete because it does not encompass everybody's memory. And conversely, the telling of history may also manipulate or shape collective memory in the present. So now for the history of the Mau Mau Rebellion. So the Mau Mau Rebellion was a response to British colonization in Kenya by the Kikuyu, who are the largest ethnic group in Kenya and still today. They, under British occupation of Kenya, they lost their land, and they were treated very inferiorly by the British. And so, like I said, the rebellion was therefore a response to the retreatment and the desire to regain the land that was stolen from them by the British. And so this inaugurated a rebellion, and the way that the Mau Mau, or the Kikuyu, were inaugurated into this rebellion was by oath taking. They swore oaths, and sometimes this meant that they cannibalistically drank the blood of Europeans. Sometimes it meant burning their crops. And these were also things that they did during the rebellion itself as well. Conversely, there were those Kikuyu who decided not to join the Mau Mau Rebellion on the side of pro-Kenyan independence and freedom and regaining stolen land. And these were called the Home Guard. The Home Guard were essentially just Kikuyu or Kenyan loyalists to the British, maybe because they were Christian, maybe because they just sympathized with the British, or they didn't like the cannibalistic, maybe oath-taking that the Mau Mau often swore into. And so the rebellion was fought, and I won't get too much into the details of the rebellion itself because my presentation is more on the memory of the event. But over time, the rebellion eventually deteriorated as Mau Mau leadership began to deteriorate from within. And so as the rebellion went on, many Mau Mau were detained, tortured, and executed by the British and British loyalists, the Home Guard. So now to get into collective memory itself. So the British labeled the Mau Mau as terrorists and pagans in order to demonize their image. And this really contaminated the way that people remember the rebellion itself. By labeling them as terrorists or by labeling them pagans, people began to see the Mau Mau in a negative light. They do not see them as people who are trying to regain stolen land. They do not see them as people who are fighting for independence or who are fighting for freedom. And this is also done because the British also wanted to keep their occupancy of the region. So after independence was gained in Kenya, Jomo Kenyatta became president, and he devised a forgive and forget policy that shaped the way collective memory of the Mau Mau was seen during this period. He sought to forgive the British loyalists and the British themselves for their role in the Mau Mau Rebellion, and to forget the Mau Mau themselves. And the reason he did this is because after the rebellion, the Kikuyu loyalists had gained much of the land after the British had left. They were the economic powerhouse, I guess you could say, in Kenya at the time. And so Jomo Kenyatta sought to forgive the British in order to appease the British loyalists who had the money to legitimize his presidency in a new country. And so that ultimately meant forgetting the Mau Mau. And so it really affected the way that people remembered them in a positive way as fighters for independence and freedom, for instance. Daniel Arap Moi, Kenya's second president, also dispossessed the Mau Mau from contemporary society by preventing them from joining civil rights groups, by labeling them taboo in society, as well as preventing them from engaging in politics, for instance. So therefore, little compensation was awarded for the Mau Mau during this time period. They did not get their land back. They were seen as the enemy still by their political leaders, despite claiming to fight for independence and freedom. And so misremembering was key during this era. The Mau Mau were not seen as something positive. So on the left there is President Jomo Kenyatta, and on the right is President Daniel Arap Moi. But you begin to see a new era emerge in the late 1990s. And then by 2002, Kenya's third president, Mwai Kibaki, who was kind of pro-Mau Mau, takes a stand of leadership in Kenya. And so Kenyan politics really shifted from something that was pro-Kikuyu, loyalists, so pro-British, to something that was pro-Mau Mau. And so this really began a new era of celebrating the Mau Mau instead of demonizing them or hating on them. And so memorialization is really the way that the Mau Mau are celebrated in this time period. Things like monuments and statues. That is a picture right there of Deann Kimathi. He is one of the most prominent and famous figures in Kenya. And people, when they see these statues, they see him as a hero. You can tell by kind of the way he's positioned that he's looking kind of honorable. And so in the previous era, from 1963 to 2002, under the two previous presidents, Deann Kimathi would have been seen more as not a villain necessarily, but maybe like an antagonist, you could just say. But now in this new era, he's more heroized. Songs are another way that memory is used during this period. When you sing a song, it evokes memory of the past. You remember things, and you remember maybe the more positive things that the Mau Mau Rebellion did, but maybe not only singing a song or hearing a song, but singing a song as well might bring back memories of the past. And also tin trunks. It's a term I can't remember the author who coined the term, but tin trunks are essentially personalized items, things like scars on veterans themselves that they received during the Mau Mau Rebellion, allow them to remember the past and to share their experiences in the community. And so, kind of moving forward here, today there's still a lot of hurt and healing, or there's still a lot of frustration and disappointment for veterans because land has not been awarded back to them. So even though there's been this shift in the way that the Mau Mau has been remembered in the 21st century, the majority of the land that they fought for during the Mau Mau Rebellion has not been returned back to them yet. And so, even though that they're more celebrated now, their memory is still kind of tainted because what they fought for has not been returned back to them. In 2011, actually, the British published documents from the 1950s about abuses the Mau Mau faced, and some of these veterans brought these documents to a British High Court, and the British High Court compensated them, but not everybody's been compensated. So there's still a lot of hurt amongst the Mau Mau, and there's a lot of healing still amongst them that is needed. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Zach. Our Our next presentation is from Noah Baumgartner, and it is Revolution and Popular Support, Arbenz in Guatemala and Estenssoro in Bolivia. Whenever you're ready.
All right, so for my paper and my presentation, I'm going to be covering the topic of revolutions and popular support. And in this, I wanted to see why revolutions gain popular support in the first place and how they lose it over time. And to do this, I looked at two case studies within Latin America around the mid-20th century and their leaders. I looked first at Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala and Paz Estenssoro in Bolivia. So firstly, we're going to cover why both were so popular. So in Guatemala, Guatemala is unique because it has the largest native population in Central America. Now this is important because at the beginning of the 20th century, Guatemala had shifted its economy to a cash crop focused economy, mainly focusing on coffee and the production of bananas later with the introduction of foreign investment. And this created a situation in where the cash crops, mainly produced on plantations, displaced the majority of the population and forced the majority of the natives to work on these plantations for little to no pay, which created a situation where most of the wealth went to a domestic elite that were Ladinos, which are mestizos from Central America. Right? So in doing so, this Ladino population used their wealth to enforce and enact laws to set up discriminatory work laws towards the natives, basically making them something close to forced wage slaves. Now, at the beginning of the 20th century, foreign companies like the United Fruit Company, now known as Chiquita Brands, I believe, introduced themselves into Guatemala and became a banana monopoly. And they had tons of land within the country. Now, this worked out for a while until the 1930s when the Great Depression happened and their economy collapsed because people weren't buying bananas and coffee as much anymore. And like in other parts of the world, Guatemala faced a fascist state, and the role of the military was increased within society, and it became more and more repressive to the majority native population. Now, turning to Bolivia, Bolivia's circumstance is similar to Guatemala, albeit it's far, far worse. So, like Guatemala, Bolivia has the largest native population within Central America, but unlike Guatemala, this is made up of multiple groups. However, in Bolivia, its economy was extremely underdeveloped. So, for example, most of its workers went into the agricultural sector in the country. However, this agricultural sector was so bad that the country could not feed itself during the time before the revolution for 1950. This also developed a situation in where the majority of the wealth of the country went to elites, and specifically, these three specific elites were the big three, which were three big tin mining companies within the country. And this is where the country made most of its wealth. Within this, the natives that worked in these mines and on these agricultural farms were basically slaves, and if not, at best, serfs. So they didn't have any representation within their democracy that exists in the country, and this democracy also led them into a war against Peru, in which they got their butts kicked really bad. So we see within both that popular support for both of these revolutions comes from a population that is extremely dispossessed and has truly no way of getting their voice out in their society, and the government doesn't represent them. And also that the government before the revolution became weak. So it breeds a perfect storm of revolutionary fervor. So turning to what actually happened during each revolution, the Guatemalan Revolution lasts for 10 years, and it went through 2 presidents. And these presidents are very important for what they did for the country. So out of the first 2, we see that we have President Juan Jose Arevalo. Now, Arevalo was an exile, an exiled professor that was elected into power by a general election for everyone in the country. Now, comparing the 2, Arevalo was a modest revolutionary, and these modest reforms are still large if you look at it comparing to having no rights at all. So he limited oligarchs' lands, he introduced a social security system, he introduced labor unions into the country, which they didn't have before, and a central banking system, which they didn't have before. And this all increased leftism within society and politics, which is important for later. Now, this is a lot of progress for the country. However, this doesn't mean that the elites were just going to stand and take it. Arevalo, during his 6-year presidency, faced 25 different coup attempts. One of these was even with a military officer that put him in power, named by a man by the name Arana. In fact, the next president, Jacobo Arbenz, and the one that I'll be analyzing the most, actually put down this rebellion with other units of the Guatemalan military. Now, turning to Jacobo Arbenz, his election was actually the first peaceful transition of power within Guatemalan history in 130 years prior to that point, right? So Arbenz was an extremely driven man, and he was an extreme revolutionary, and his policies, while they may not be as important to discuss here, were designed to modernize the economy and destroy every part of the old order to change Guatemala and propel it forward into the next century. And one of these was Decree 900, which is the most important and probably the most radical decree of the Guatemalan Revolution. And it's a giant land reform. And this land reform expropriated large amounts of land from the largest landowners in the country. And this affected both domestic and foreign land. So now turning to, we can see from this that there are giant steps forward in progress within Guatemala. So turning to Bolivia, unlike Guatemala, Bolivia was dominated by a single party. This is known as the MNR. And in this party, the main figurehead was Paz Estenssoro. Now, during their time in power, Paz wasn't necessarily the president during the time, but he had a large grip on the whole party as a whole. So Paz and the other MNR members come out of the gate very strong. So Bolivia had no representation for a majority of its population. So their first inaction was universal suffrage for everyone. Men, women, unlanded people, illiterate people. The majority of the population was illiterate, in fact, so they were barred from voting. So this increases his power base a ton. And unlike in Guatemala, Bolivia in the MNR actually purged the old regime. So they don't face any old threats to their revolution. So like Guatemala as well, they also nationalize companies and lands, but they only do domestic companies and lands. They don't touch any foreign assets. However, this was mismanaged. Every national asset that they had was extremely mismanaged, and their economy started to falter by the end of the line, and this was also aided by U.S. economic involvement. And however, the U.S. The Bolivian Revolution was the only revolution that the U.S. Supported. However, this support corrupted their economy over time. So why did these revolutions lose support? So from the details of what happened in each revolution, you can see that Arbenz actually pushed his reforms too far. which is surprising to hear for most of us because you would think that most people would be in support of sweeping land reforms that help out the majority of people. But in fact, the domestic elites hated this, and foreign companies also hated that they lost a good portions of their land. So his reforms, pushing too far, increased the aggressiveness of his political opposition. And it didn't, however, increase the loyalty of their peasant base, because this peasant base was already satisfied with what Arevalo had given them in his first term. They didn't need more than what they had because they had nothing before. And if you're already satisfied with the little that you have when you have nothing, then you don't need more. So he also failed to increase the loyalty of the army, and which is odd because he was a military officer and a very good one at that. But this is important to why he failed over time, because his revolution, when it came time, wasn't defended by the army. And most army units, in fact, didn't fight counter-revolutionaries. And now, in Estenssoro's case, that revolution failed because of the mismanagement of the Revolutionary Party. They mismanaged all of their reforms, and the base that they initially had changed. Once they had land, the peasant population was no longer revolutionary liberals. They became conservatives because of the systems that they had previously dealt with. Now, his final nail in the coffin was his attempt to break the revolutionary constitution and re-seize power, into which he was couped by the military. So what happened after? Going through quickly, Guatemala faced U.S. intervention. Now, this was the first of its kind in Latin America, and it was a CIA operation known as Operation PBS Success. And it helped aid a man named Carlos Castillo Armas to take power. Now, this was mainly an information campaign done with flying jets over the country to try and dissuade a lot of people from fighting, but it worked pretty well. So after the fact, Carlos Castillo Armas was basically a fascist, and all of the reforms and progress that the revolution made for the country were completely reversed once he got into power. And afterwards, a military junta actually ruled the country up until the 2000s, I believe. And during this time, Guatemala faced a constant civil war in which the native population, or parts of the native population, were warring against the government. And this resulted in a Guatemala genocide. Now, Guatemala hasn't been able to recover to its revolutionary state even till today, almost 70 to 80 years later. And Bolivia faces the same situation. U.S. aid collapsed its economy, and it faced bankruptcy after the revolution. And just like in Guatemala, there was a coup by the military, and it faced successive repressive regimes towards its people. And the old values that were eliminated by the revolution just came straight back. So even today, the Bolivian economy still hasn't recovered, and it's still facing political and social instability from its native population.
Thank you, Noah. We're going to close out our panel with Deann Top, who is presenting on peaceful resistance in the People Power Revolution in the Philippines. Whenever you're ready.
So good morning, my name is Deann Top, and the topic of my presentation is on the People Power Revolution of 1986 in the Philippines. When we think about revolutions, most revolutions that come to mind are known for their violence, like the French or Bolshevik revolutions. However, during this third wave of democratization in the 20th century, revolutionary strategies shifted. These new third-wave revolutions rejected the violent revolutionary model of the Bolsheviks and preferred peaceful methods of resistance. One of the earliest resistance in this wave was the 1986 People Power Revolution in the Philippines. The methods used during the People Power Revolution would be later used in later third-wave revolutions like the anti-authoritarian revolutions in Eastern Europe. It showed how everyday people can mass mobilize to peacefully advocate for change against corruption and repression by successfully overthrowing a dictator and restoring democracy. So for some background information, the People Power Revolution removed Ferdinand Marcos from power in February of 1986. He was relatively popular for his first term and even got reelected, but his second term was marked with corruption and civil rights. Any opposition to Marcos was silenced and repressed, and often brutally in extrajudicial killings. Meanwhile, Marcos's cronies were rewarded with political favors. Wealth inequality in the Philippines grew as workers' wages decreases and debt skyrocketed as Marcos spent foreign loans on a wasteful project. One of these projects became a symbol of the regime's contradictory excess. This 98-foot tall bust made in the likeliness of Ferdinand Marcos was given the name Mount Cash No More, referencing the giant debt he accrued. Because of its construction, the indigenous people that lived on the land, the Ibaloi, were displaced and forced to sell the land for cheap. Due to the limits set by the Constitution, Marcos' presidency was supposed to be limited to 2 terms. But to sidestep this, Marcos placed the Philippines under martial law. So this began a 14-year martial law period where the previous problems of wealth, inequality, corruption, and civil rights abuses were exacerbated, and Marcos ruled absolutely. He used his newfound power to further suppress dissent and arrested political rivals. Despite this, at this point, opposition was mainly confined to leftist groups. And because many leftist political parties were outlawed by Marcos, leftists organized into a leftist coalition called the National Democratic Front, which was made out of different leftist organizations like the Communist Party of the Philippines and the New People's Army. These consisted of Marxist-Leninist Maoists, which, unlike the moderate opposition that was most prominent in the People Power Revolution, the National Democratic Front violently fought against the Marcos regime's oppression using guerrilla warfare. Besides that, many Filipinos valued the stability that an uprising would disrupt and were content with mild economic gains. However, this all changed when a popular leader of the opposition to Marcos was assassinated. Former senator and critic of Marcos, Benigno Aquino Jr., was returning to the Philippines after years of exile in the United States when he was shot by the military in August 1983. Due to this, the protests erupted across the Philippines. 3 to 4 million people attended Benigno Aquino's funeral, then took to the streets. Most of the opposition rallied around Benigno Aquino's widow, Corazon Aquino. In her rallies, like the Tagumpay ng Bayan rally, she called for a campaign of disobedience against Marcos' regime. So due to the pressure of this, Marcos called for snap elections to be held on August 7, 1986. Somewhat unsurprisingly, these elections were rigged to Marcos' favor. The election only worsened the protests, and even some military defected and rallied around military leaders like Juan Ponce Enrile and Fidel V. Ramos. One example of the successes of the People Power Revolution is how the protesters successfully kept the rebel military from major conflicts with Marcos' loyalist forces. Thousands of protests coalesced to the Epifano de los Santos Avenue highway, where they cushioned the rebel encampments from loyalists sent to crush the revolution. Marcos sent waves of military units to try and dispatch the revolution. However, protesters created a human barricade as a shield for the rebels. They would link arms and rosaries and sing songs or pray together. Larger groups surrounded tanks and soldiers to restrict them from advancing into the camps. They tried to convince the soldiers to retreat or defect by praying or reciting the rosary to them, as you can see here. Others would give them flowers as peace offerings. All of these things worked. Despite orders from Marcos authorizing the killing of civilians that got in the way of crushing the rebels, they hesitated from firing into the crowd. Blocked from moving any further by the masses of protesters, they were forced to retreat or defect to the rebels. Another successful tactic that was used during the People Power Revolution was the use of Xerox journalism, or the mosquito press. Marcos's first action under martial law was the complete shutdown of any kind of media. Every major newspaper, radio, or television station was closed. From the enactment of martial law until Marcos was deposed, the only media that was allowed had to be government-owned or approved by the Media Advisory Council. His cronyism expanded to the media too. His allies were favored to run newspapers or radio or television stations to manage and spew pro-Marxist propaganda. His reasons for complete government control over the media was to tamp down on libel and to stop the influence of communism. He called the media weapons of modern revolution and said that the free press was causing disorder. Marcos used the power given to him by martial law to repress dissent. Influential journalists that spoke up against the regime were arrested, and any media that paid lip service to him were allowed to continue to run. This meant that every piece of news that was allowed to run was only a positive reflection on Marcos, and the corruption and civil rights abuses were left unreported. So to counter the propaganda, of Marcos-aligned media, the opposition to Marcos created their own independent news sources underground. The Philippines had a legacy of free press. Before martial law, it had one of the freest in Asia. It was inherited from the likes of the Kalayaan during the Philippine Revolution against the Spanish and the La Independencia during the Philippine-American War. Free press would be difficult to get rid of in the Philippines. So to Marcos' chagrin, mosquito presses started appearing. These newspapers gained their name when Marcos derogatorily called them mosquitoes because they were short-lived newspapers that were hard to get rid of due to the sheer number of them. When one was shut down, it could easily be replaced by another newspaper. And the most well-known of these are the We Form, and I have a issue here of the Pahad Malaya. Oppositionists further supported these independent presses by boycotting state-affiliated news sources. So with these mosquito presses, news was able to get out unfiltered by the censors of the government, and through these, people could read critiques of Marcos' government and learn about the problems plaguing it. With the help of these tactics and more, Filipinos were able to overthrow Marcos' authoritarian regime. Marcos fled to Hawaii on February 26, 1986, and Corazon Aquino, widow of the assassinated senator, was inaugurated that same day. There is no doubt it exceeded in its short-term goals. The dictator that was plaguing the Philippines for so long was deposed, and Aquino was brought into power. However, the long-term successes of the People Power Revolution are dubious. It did indeed bring back liberal democracy to the Philippines, like the creation of the Fifth Republic and a new constitution that included safeguards from Marcos's exploitative use of martial law. However, the government was still unstable. Aquino had inherited a broken system that was riddled with economic problems and corruption that would need time to heal. The rebel soldiers turned against her for her attempted peace talks with the communists, which fell through and who also continued to rebel. The soldiers unsuccessfully tried to coup her government multiple times. And the government also faced natural disasters, like the eruption of Mount Pinatubo in 1991, which was the second largest eruption in the 20th century, caused even more strain on an already destroyed economy. Even today, Filipinos still struggle with corruption in their government. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much to our three panelists. We now have some time for questions. If you have a question, Dr. Lipschitz has the microphone.
It has to be on that somewhere.
I mean, I could just stand up and talk very loudly. I've been told I'm very good at that.
I don't know if CTV will approve.
Thank you. I had a question for Dina, but actually, if the other two panelists had an opinion on it, I would also be interested in what they thought. Specifically, I noticed that we talked about, through the three of you, 4 different national revolutions in the second half of the 20th century. And it seems like 3 of those revolutions were ultimately unsuccessful in meeting kind of their stated ends. But it seems like with the people power movement in the Philippines, you kind of end on a bit of a sour note, but overall, compared to the other 3, far more successful. So I was just curious as to why you thought that the people power movement was so successful and it was able to at least meet its initial objectives of removing the Marcos regime and replacing it with a liberal democracy.
Yeah, in my opinion, why the People Power Revolution was so successful was that it was more moderate. So like the middle class and in the Philippines, religion is really big. So the Catholic Church had a lot of power. So I think that helped cause more pressure on the Marcos government. So like the more radical elements didn't get as much of their goals achieved.
Thank you.
Anyone else want to weigh in on it?
Great papers. I have a quick question for the other two panelists. For Noah, so in one instance, Guatemala, the U.S. intervened and failed. In the other instance, Bolivia, the U.S. supported and it failed. So my question to you is, so is internal politics and stuff more important than external factors in these failures? And for Zach, I was curious about the nature of nationalism after the ousting of the British, given the fact that this revolution, the resistance, was not celebrated.
I'd say that internal politics are probably just as important as foreign intervention in a way, because each foreign intervention, the internal politics that happened to fail each sort of revolution only had they only had like a little bit of support from an external source, but like without that source, it probably would have happened like the same, I guess. So like, for example, in Guatemala, the PBS success it helped. So it definitely did help Carlos, but without it, he probably would have failed. But Bolivia, the mismanagement of U.S. aid, was going to bankrupt the economy anyway, with or without it. So it's important, but I would say it's just as important as internal policies of like what is happening inside.
Okay. So for mine, I would say that kind of like at the outset of the rebellion or afterwards, the rebellion itself was maybe still kind of celebrated, but it wasn't really, it just wasn't positive from a Mau Mau's perspective. There was still nationalism in terms of like, commemorating a response to freedom and independence, but yeah.
It didn't derail the nationalist element.
I don't think so.
Thank you. That was another awesome panel, and I love how all those three papers fit together, even though they were written for different classes and different
instances. And one of the things that I liked so much about this panel, and actually the previous panel as well, is that it demonstrated what we historians love to teach about how the telling of history is not static, right? And that there are so many different interpretations to events, and those interpretations kind of change and emerge as time goes on. So I want to start with a question for Noah and then kind of attempt at a Schuster-like broad question for the entire panel. So Noah, I have to say you anticipated in some ways the lecture that I'm giving to my history of espionage class on Monday. Those of you take notes. But I found it quite interesting when you had your slide up of the failure of the Guatemalan Revolution, that at first I saw all of those bullets and I did not see the CIA involvement at all, which just kind of made me laugh and reminded me that, you know, even professors are guilty of telling the story that we want to tell. So I am not a historian of Guatemala. I am not a historian of Latin America. So when I put together my lecture notes for that lesson, I read accounts of the CIA's involvement. And the takeaway I've taken from this particular moment in the Guatemalan Revolution is a heavy involvement of the CIA. So I would be curious to hear a little bit more about the sources that you read, that granted I have not read, that talk about the Arbenz's failure to mobilize the peasantry. That kind of surprised me that you said that. And if you, and maybe you kind of corrected this in your answer to Weiner, but how important you think the CIA's involvement was. Again, when I'm going to lecture this to my class, I'm going to talk about the CIA a lot, and I'm going to talk about how, you know, all of the various steps that Operation PB Success took to discourage support for Arbenz. I also was curious if you think something I've read is that Arbenz had a role in murdering Arevalo before him, if you think that that is true or not, which you didn't mention because that was the 2 stages of it, or whether that's a conspiracy theory. So that is for you. And then for the panel generally, I guess I would just love to hear you guys reflect on kind of the way that stories of victimhood and perpetration, or victims and perpetrators, have been told regarding the 3 different revolutions that you talked about, and the memory of those revolutions. And if you think those people who do tell the stories have a reason. You know, the idea of victimhood, sometimes it's viewed in positive light, sometimes it's viewed in negative light. Are the perpetrators, whether it's, you know, the British or the Mau Mau, you know, so how have these stories changed over time as to who are the good guys, who are the bad guys? Are there good guys, are there bad guys? Does it matter to the regimes that are in power now, or the regimes that have been in power along the way? So I have asked a lot of questions. Feel free to ignore them all or answer one that you think is relevant to you. But yeah, great job, guys. I'd like to hear a little more.
If you don't want to do them all, pick at least some of them.
Noah, do you want to start with the specifics?
Okay. Okay, I'm trying to remember every question, but the CIA did have a much larger involvement than I guess I talked about. So Armas and the counter-revolutionaries, I believe, were trained by the CIA in Nicaragua, which the Nicaraguan revolution is a whole different bag of marbles to throw down, I guess. But they did have a really large involvement in it, but they would have still failed if, you know, Arbenz actually was able to gain the support of the military and the peasantry. So a lot of what the CIA did was like information campaigns, training, and stuff like that. But there's no, I don't believe that there was actually any U.S. combatants during the counter-revolutionary stage of the revolution. Trying to remember some of the other questions. And I do know that the on a different topic, that the CIA used their success here to sort of as a blueprint for what to do in Cuba later on, but yeah, they used it as a successful blueprint, but there are a lot of other factors that made this one a success and the other one's failures. And yeah.
Okay, so I would say like the relationship, if you want to look at like the relationship between victims and perpetrators and kind of how that's evolved over time and also really established a memory of the rebellion, I would say that politics really plays a large role because you see such heavy manipulation going on, and or maybe like in the first two presidents' cases, they really dictated the way that discourse of the rebellion was discussed, and so that in turn affected the victims and the way that society remembers things, and so that kind of remains constant until there's like a big change or a big shift. And I think that you can pretty much say that memory itself is, on an individual level, can be remembered a certain way, but over time, like it remains constant. I'm not sure.
So for the different ways the revolution is interpreted, this revolution was fairly recent, so it's still like in the minds of a lot of people, and the narrative hasn't changed quite that much. But the current president of the Philippines now is actually the son of Ferdinand Marcos, so the official narrative is now taking more like a more positive spin on Ferdinand Marcos and a negative spin on the revolution. As for like civilian narratives in general, there's a lot of different ones. Like my mom, who actually lived through this revolution, is actually more pro Marcos than me. So some people thought that the Philippines was better off before the revolution because there were some minor economic improvements, while others thought the revolution was good because it restored democratic institutions. And like I cut this out, but it's still it's still like as a motif, used as a motif in like activism in the Philippines today. Like there's like never again for martial law and stuff is a common slogan.
Oh yeah, and then I remember one of the other questions that you asked me. So on the sources, on the sources, I looked at two. One was by a man named Nick Kofferman, I believe, and he actually had the privilege of working with CIA operatives and archives in the 90s, and going through a lot of CIA archives about the topic. Because I think in the 90s, when the Soviet Union fell, they released a ton of information from their I think it's the FSB or the KGB, sorry, the KGB, that they released a ton of information about operations that they did during the time of the Soviet Union. And the CIA decided to do similar stuff for things that had happened that by that point had been like 40 years. So one, he had analyzed a ton of that information and put it into a secondary source. And then the other one was from a historian from Temple University. I think his name was Richard Immerman, and his book in the 80s sort of analyzing CIA involvement in Guatemala and about, I think he got to look through or had some sources from the CIA to talk about as well.
So were there theories that without CIA intervention, the internal politics were so weak that he likely would have been overthrown anyways?
I think that, I'm not sure if there were theories or not, but it's possible, but it would have been a lot harder without CIA intervention. Like the training, Armas he was already a military member, and I think a lot of the counter-revolutionaries were from the military. And the reason why a lot of the military didn't support Arbenz during that counter-revolutionary stage was that I think a lot of them especially the officers, came from wealthier families within the country, And a lot of his policies, although they benefited the country as a whole, sort of took away from them. And if that affects them, they're not going to support him anyway. So.
Okay, so let's.
Okay, can we have one more round of applause for our panelists?